My 7-year-old son died on a Tuesday. They buried him on a Friday. My parents couldn't be bothered to show up. The funeral home was packed with people who'd known Ethan for 7 years, 7 months, or 7 minutes. Teachers, neighbors, strangers who'd heard about the accident and felt compelled to pay their respects to a little boy whose smile could light up entire rooms. I sat in the front row, staring at a casket so small it looked like it belonged in a different world, surrounded by white roses I'd chosen, because they were his favorite. Behind me, 300 people who'd made time to say goodbye to my child. But not his own grandparents. Not the people who'd held him as a baby, who'd promised to love him forever, who'd spent 7 years telling me I was raising him wrong but had never missed a chance to take credit for raising him right. Their empty seats screamed louder than any eulogy. 14 days later, my phone rang. My mother's voice, crisp and businesslike, cut straight to the point. "Savannah, we need to discuss Ethan's trust fund. Your brother's engagement party is next month, and $500,000 would ensure it's absolutely perfect." They couldn't find time to bury my son, but they had plenty of time to spend his money. My name is Savannah Moore, 38 years old. To the outside world, my family was the picture of respectability, weekly attendance at First Baptist, coordinated outfits and holiday photos, the kind of suburban success story that looks perfect from a distance. But beneath the carefully curated frame, I was always the afterthought, the burden, the daughter asked to step aside so the real star could shine. Growing up in our 4-bedroom colonial in Westfield, New Jersey, I learned early that love in the Moore household was distributed like inheritance, unequally, based on arbitrary rules I'd never been taught but was expected to follow. My younger brother Michael was the golden son, the heir apparent, the child who could do no wrong even when he was doing everything wrong. Family dinners at our mahogany table were performances where Michael's achievements filled every conversation like helium balloons, expanding to take up all available space while my voice was drowned in the deliberate clink of silverware against china. When I tried to share news about making honor roll or winning the school essay contest, my mother would smile that practice smile and redirect. "That's nice, dear. Michael, tell us more about the soccer scholarship." The holidays were psychological warfare disguised as celebration. Michael's gifts sparkled under our Christmas tree like precious gems: gaming systems, designer clothes, electronics that cost more than most families spent on groceries. Mine were afterthoughts wrapped in leftover paper from the previous year, practical items that whispered obligation instead of love. A backpack when I needed a laptop. A generic watch when he got a car. "Savannah doesn't need as much," my mother would explain to relatives who occasionally noticed the disparity. "She's more practical. More sensible." Sensible was code for less deserving. Practical meant cheaper to maintain. I was the low-maintenance daughter who learned to expect less so they could give more to the child who mattered. The memory that carved itself into my soul happened when I was 15. I'd been accepted to a summer program at Columbia, full scholarship, a chance to study journalism with professors who'd worked at major newspapers. I was ecstatic, finally holding proof that I was special, that I had value beyond being Michael's older sister. I burst into my father's home office, acceptance letter trembling in my hands, ready to share the best news of my teenage life. He looked up from his computer with the expression he reserved for interruptions, mild annoyance masked as patience. "Dad, look, I got into Columbia's summer journalism program. Full scholarship." He glanced at the letter like it was a grocery receipt, then back at his computer screen. "That's good, Savannah. But remember, be grateful for scraps. Your brother is the one who'll carry our name forward. Don't get ideas above your station." The words hit me like a physical blow. Not congratulations. Not pride. A reminder that even my achievements were somehow threats to Michael's supremacy. That excellence from the wrong child was dangerous to the family hierarchy they'd established before I was old enough to understand I was on the losing side of it. That sentence burned into me like a cattle brand, marking me as property that belonged to someone else's success story. Be grateful for scraps. Your brother is the one who matters. Michael got everything handed to him: college tuition, a car, a job at my father's accounting firm straight out of graduation, complete with a salary he'd never had to earn, and respect he'd never had to prove. Meanwhile, I worked 3 part-time jobs to pay for community college, lived at home until I was 23, and listened to dinner table conversations about Michael's promising future while my present remained invisible. When I finally moved out, got married, and started building a life that didn't revolve around being Michael's supporting cast, I thought maybe distance would change the dynamic. Maybe becoming an adult would earn me the respect that childhood achievements never had. Then I got pregnant. For 9 months, I believed that motherhood would shift the scales, that giving my parents a grandson would finally prove my value to the family legacy they cared so much about. I imagined them softening, becoming the grandparents who'd make up for being the parents I'd never had. Ethan arrived on a snowy December morning, 7 pounds 6 ounces of perfect possibility. I'd never felt love like that, immediate, unconditional, fierce enough to rearrange my entire understanding of what it meant to protect someone. He was mine in a way nothing had ever been mine, and I was his in a way I'd never belonged to anyone. My parents came to the hospital, brought flowers, took the obligatory photos. My mother held him for exactly 3 minutes before handing him back with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. My father nodded approvingly and mentioned how much Ethan looked like Michael had as a baby. Even my son's existence was filtered through comparisons to their golden child. But I told myself it would get better. That grandparent love would develop over time, that Ethan's charm would work magic my own childhood had never managed. I brought him to family dinners, enrolled him in activities they could attend, sent photos and videos of every milestone. They were politely interested, appropriately engaged. They remembered his birthday, sent Christmas gifts, played the role of loving grandparents when other people were watching. But I could feel the difference between obligation and affection, between performing grandparent duties and actually being moved by their grandson's existence. They loved Ethan the way they'd loved me, conditionally, comparatively, with one eye always on what Michael might produce that would be more impressive. When Michael got engaged to his college girlfriend, a pharmaceutical sales rep named Jessica, whose family had more money than God and less warmth than a morgue, my parents' attention shifted like spotlights following the real star onto center stage. Every conversation became about wedding plans, future grandchildren who would matter more than the one they already had, the legacy that would finally live up to their expectations. Ethan was 7 years old, brilliant and funny and kind in ways that should have made any grandparent grateful for the privilege of knowing him. But to them, he was just practice for the grandchildren who would really count, the ones who'd carry the right last name, inherit the right expectations, be raised by parents who'd never been afterthoughts in their own family story. I thought I'd made peace with being the shadow daughter. I thought I'd built enough of my own life that their approval didn't matter anymore. But watching them treat my son the same way they'd treated me, like an understudy in someone else's story, reactivated every wound I'd spent years trying to heal. I just never imagined how deep their indifference could cut until the day I needed them most, and discovered they'd rather celebrate someone else's happiness than acknowledge my devastation. The accident happened on a Wednesday afternoon in October, the kind of crisp fall day that should have been about raking leaves and hot apple cider. Not the screech of brakes and the sound that still wakes me up at 3 a.m, metal against metal, physics against flesh. A 7-year-old boy's laughter cut short by one driver's momentary glance at a text message. Ethan had been walking home from school, taking the same route he'd taken 100 times before, when a distracted mother in a Honda Pilot ran the stop sign at Elm and 3rd. She was texting her own child about pickup times, she told the police later, sobbing apologies that couldn't resurrect the grandson my parents would never bother to mourn. I got the call at 2:47 p.m., while I was in a client meeting, discussing quarterly projections for a company whose problems suddenly seemed microscopic compared to the words coming through my phone. "Ma'am, there's been an accident. You need to get to St. Barnabas Hospital immediately." The 20-minute drive to the emergency room lasted approximately 7 lifetimes. I ran red lights, left my car in a handicapped space, sprinted through automatic doors that moved too slowly for the urgency clawing at my chest, but I was already too late. By the time I reached the trauma bay, Ethan had been gone for 12 minutes, his small body finally still after 7 years of constant motion. The doctor was kind, professional, gentle in the way that people who deliver devastating news learn to be. But all I heard was silence where my son's heartbeat used to be. All I saw was a hospital room too white and too quiet for someone who'd painted every wall in our house with fingerprints and filled every corner with the kind of joyful noise that makes neighbors smile instead of complain. I called my parents from the hospital parking lot, sitting in my car with the engine off and the October wind making everything feel colder than it should have been. My hands shook as I dialed their number, dreading the conversation but knowing they needed to hear about Ethan from me, not from some Facebook post or neighborhood gossip. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice carrying that familiar tone of mild irritation that came whenever I interrupted her schedule. "Savannah? I'm about to leave for bridge club. Can this wait?" "Mom." My voice cracked like ice under pressure. "Ethan's been in an accident. He didn't make it." The silence that followed lasted exactly 6 seconds. I know because I counted them. The way you count everything when your world stops making sense and numbers are the only thing that still adds up. "Oh," she said finally. "Oh dear. That's terrible. How are you holding up?" How was I holding up? My 7-year-old son was dead, and she was asking how I was holding up like I'd gotten a parking ticket or burned dinner. "The funeral will be Friday," I managed, "at First Methodist. 11 o'clock. "Friday? This Friday?" A pause. "Oh, Savannah, that's unfortunate timing. Michael's engagement party is Saturday, and we have so much to prepare. Jessica's parents are flying in from California, and the caterer needs to discuss final details, and your father promised to help set up the tent." Her voice faded into background noise as the magnitude of what she was saying crystallized in my chest like ice forming around my heart. My son was dead, and she was worried about party planning. "Are you saying you won't be there?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "It's not that we don't want to be there, dear. It's just, well, Michael's engagement only happens once, and we've already made commitments. People are depending on us. Surely you understand." I understood perfectly. I understood that their dead grandson mattered less than their living son's party. I understood that grief was inconvenient when it conflicted with celebration. I understood that even in death, Ethan would come second to Michael's milestones. The funeral was scheduled for 11 a.m. on a Friday that dawned gray and drizzling, as if the sky itself was mourning the child who'd spent 7 years trying to catch raindrops on his tongue. First Methodist was fuller than I'd expected. Ethan's teachers, his soccer teammates, neighbors who'd watched him grow up, friends from work who'd taken the morning off to support a colleague they barely knew outside the office. I sat in the front pew wearing a black dress I'd bought at Macy's because nothing in my closet seemed appropriate for burying your child, staring at a casket so small it looked like it belonged in a different universe. Ethan's school photo sat beside white roses he would have tried to smell if he'd been there to see them, his gap-toothed smile frozen at age 7, forever missing the front teeth the tooth fairy had collected just 2 weeks before. The service was beautiful in the way that funerals for children always are, full of stories about potential that would never be realized, dreams that would never come true, a future that had been stolen by one woman's momentary distraction and one family's lifelong indifference. But throughout the entire ceremony, my eyes kept scanning the pews behind me, searching for the 2 faces that should have been there more than anyone else's. Empty seats in the 3rd row where my parents should have been sitting, their absence echoing louder than the organ music, more noticeable than the flowers, more devastating than the eulogies. People noticed. I could see it in their glances, hear it in their whispered conversations after the service as we made our way to the cemetery. Where are her parents? Where's her family? How is she going through this alone? The burial was worse. Standing beside a grave that was too small, watching a casket that was too light being lowered into ground that was too cold, surrounded by people who'd loved Ethan but who would go home to their own children while I went home to his empty bedroom. The minister spoke about heaven and peace and reunions that would happen someday, but all I could think about was the 2 people who should have been holding me up and had chosen absence over love. After everyone else left, I stood there alone in Riverside Cemetery, watching the groundskeepers fill in the hole that would hold my son forever, thinking about the engagement party happening the next day where my parents would smile for photos and toast to Michael's future, while Ethan's future rotted in New Jersey soil. That night, I sat in Ethan's bedroom, surrounded by toys he'd never play with again, books we'd never finish reading together, clothes he'd never outgrow. The silence was different than the silence of sleep. This was the silence of absence, of a house that would never again echo with the footsteps of someone who'd made every day feel like Christmas morning. My phone sat on his nightstand, silent. No calls from my parents asking how the service had gone. No texts offering condolences or support. No acknowledgement that they'd missed the most important day in their daughter's life because they were busy preparing to celebrate their son's engagement. Grief was supposed to be shared, I thought. It was supposed to bring families together, make people realize what really mattered, strip away the petty differences that seemed important until death reminded you what wasn't. Instead, I carried it alone, my parents' absence like a second coffin beside the first, their indifference heavier than any casket I'd ever helped bear. Somewhere in Westfield, they were probably discussing seating charts for Saturday's party, debating whether the shrimp cocktail would be enough, or if they needed additional appetizers, making sure every detail was perfect for the child who mattered enough to merit their full attention. And I was sitting in a dead boy's bedroom, finally understanding that some wounds are so deep they change the landscape of your heart forever, that some betrayals are so complete they rewrite the story of who your family really is. The engagement party would be perfect. Michael and Jessica would beam in photographs my parents would frame and display in places where Ethan's school pictures had never been given prominence. Everyone would toast to love and future grandchildren who would actually be celebrated instead of tolerated. But none of them would mention the grandson who'd been buried the day before, or the daughter who'd learned that even death couldn't make her important enough to prioritize. 2 weeks after I buried my son, the phone rang at 3:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, another day that could never be ordinary again. I was in Ethan's room, folding clothes he'd never wear, deciding what to keep and what to give away, when the ringtone shattered the silence like a chainsaw in a cathedral. My mother's name lit up the screen. For one fragile second, I thought maybe finally they were calling to check on me. I answered on the fourth ring, my voice hoarse from crying myself to sleep for 2 weeks. "Mom?" "Savannah, hello dear." Her voice was casual, like she was asking me to pick up milk. "I hope you're doing well. Listen, I'm calling about Michael's wedding. The budget is higher than expected. Jessica wants everything perfect. The venue alone is $40,000, and that's before catering and flowers. We'll need the $500,000 from Ethan's trust. He won't be needing it anymore, and Michael's future is what matters now." Her words hit like a physical blow. I clutched one of Ethan's t-shirts, still faintly scented with his strawberry shampoo. "What did you just say?" "The trust, dear. Your grandmother set it up for Ethan's education, but since that's no longer necessary, it makes sense to use it for something meaningful. Michael's wedding will be the event of the season. Everyone who matters will be there." Then, the silence between us widened into a canyon. Then my father's voice cut in, sharp and impatient. "Savannah, don't be selfish. It's for family. Michael deserves the best, and that money is just sitting there. Your grandmother would have wanted it used for something important." Selfish. I was selfish for wanting to protect my dead son's trust, but they were noble for demanding it for flowers, photographers, and an open bar. "You mean the money my grandmother scraped together for Ethan by clipping coupons, wearing the same coat for 15 years, skipping vacations so her great-grandson could have the education she never had?" "Well, when you put it that way it sounds harsh," my mother replied, slipping into her defensive tone. "But really, Savannah, letting it sit untouched isn't honoring Ethan. Using it to give Michael and Jessica the wedding they deserve, that's making something positive out of a tragedy." Very sad. Positive out of a tragedy. My 7-year-old son was dead, and she was rebranding his trust fund as an opportunity for event planning. "You didn't even come to his funeral," I whispered. "You couldn't find one day to bury your grandson, but you can find time to spend his inheritance on cake and party favors?" "That's not fair," my father shot back. "We had commitments. Michael's engagement party was planned months in advance. People were depending on us. It was unfortunate timing." Then, unfortunate timing. My child's death was nothing more than a scheduling conflict. "And besides," my mother added, her patience thinning, "you don't need the money now. Keeping it just keeps you stuck in grief. Moving forward means helping your brother start his marriage right. That would be healing for you too." Healing, by funding the wedding of the golden son, with money saved for the grandson they never truly loved. I thought of my grandmother, the woman who had visited Ethan every Sunday, brought him candy, let him dig in her garden, even if she had to replant later. The trust had been her idea. $500,000 amassed from a lifetime of sacrifice because Ethan's future mattered more than her comfort. She created that trust for Ethan, I said. She wanted him to have choices she never had. And my father replied, cold as stone, "Now he doesn't have a future. The money should go where it can do some good. Michael is family. His happiness matters to us all. Michael's happiness, not Ethan's memory, not my grief, not my grandmother's sacrifice. Always Michael." "You know what?" I said, my voice steadying. You're right, family does matter. Which is why Ethan's trust will honor the one family member who truly loved him. It's going into a scholarship. For kids whose grandparents show up to their funerals. For kids whose families choose love over appearances. The silence this time was different, the silence of people realizing they'd gone too far, asked for something so grotesque that even their compliant daughter couldn't be bullied into saying yes. You're being ridiculous, my father snapped. Ungrateful, after everything we've done for you. Everything they'd done, 38 years of making me feel like an obligation, missing the most important day of my life. And now, demanding my dead child's inheritance. You're right, I said. I am ungrateful. Ungrateful for wasting 38 years chasing love you were never going to give. Ungrateful for letting you treat my son the way you treated me. And ungrateful that it took Ethan's death for me to finally see who you really are. I hung up before they could answer, my hands shaking as I set the phone on Ethan's nightstand next to the piggy bank, where he'd been saving quarters for a bicycle he'd never ride. Outside, life went on, neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes, families heading to dinner tables where everyone wanted to be there. But inside Ethan's room, something broke, completely, irreparably. The last thread tying me to my parents had snapped, severed by greed so profound, it turned my child's death into their opportunity, my grief into their financial plan. The safe in my home office hadn't been opened since the day I'd filed Ethan's trust fund documents 3 years earlier. The combination was his birthday, the 7th of December 2016, numbers that used to make me smile, and now made my chest ache with the weight of everything he'd never become. But as I knelt on the hardwood floor 2 days after that phone call, my hands weren't trembling with grief anymore. They were steady with something harder, sharper, more dangerous than sorrow. They were trembling with fury that had crystallized into purpose. Inside the safe, beneath insurance policies and birth certificates, and all the paperwork that proves a life existed, lay the trust fund documents my grandmother had signed with arthritic hands that shook from Parkinson's, but held steady when it came to securing her great-grandson's future. For the first time since Ethan died, I wasn't looking at evidence of what I'd lost. I was looking at proof of what they'd tried to steal. Not just his money, his memory, his grandmother's love. The sacrifices an old woman had made, so a little boy could have choices she'd never been offered. They didn't just fail me when they skipped his funeral. They erased him. Turned him into a line item in Michael's wedding budget. Reduced his existence to 500,000 reasons why their living son's happiness mattered more than their dead grandson's legacy. I pulled out every document, spread them across my desk like evidence in a trial where I was finally ready to be both prosecutor and judge. Trust agreements, beneficiary forms, investment statements showing decades of careful growth from a woman who'd eaten canned soup for dinner so her great-grandson could eat at better tables than she'd ever known. Then I did something that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks earlier, when I was still the dutiful daughter who apologized for taking up space. I shredded every piece of paper that gave my parents even theoretical access to Ethan's inheritance. The sound of the paper shredder was mechanical, final, oddly satisfying. Each document that disappeared into metal teeth was another bridge burned between me and people who'd mistaken my grief for weakness. My love for leverage they could manipulate whenever Michael needed funding for his perfect life. But destroying their hope of access wasn't enough. I called my lawyer, a woman named Patricia Chen who'd handled my divorce 3 years earlier, and understood what it meant to untangle yourself from people who'd never had your best interests at heart. I want to establish an educational scholarship fund, I told her. My voice steady in a way that would have surprised the woman who'd spent 38 years seeking approval from people who were never going to give it. The Ethan Moore Memorial Scholarship. For kids whose families show up when it matters. The paperwork took 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which my parents called 17 times, left 12 voicemails, and sent enough text messages to fill a small book with variations on the same theme. I was being selfish, unreasonable, cruel to Michael and Jessica, disrespectful to family traditions that had never included respect for me. I answered none of them. Instead, I changed the locks on my house. Every door, every window, every entrance that might allow people who'd never been welcome to force their way back into a space where Ethan's memory lived in every corner they'd never bothered to visit when he was alive to make noise in it. I deleted their numbers from my phone, removed them from every social media account, blocked their email addresses with the systematic efficiency of someone performing surgery on her own life, cutting away infected tissue that had been poisoning her bloodstream for decades. The hardest part wasn't the practical logistics of erasing them from my contact lists. It was learning to exist in the space their absence created, learning to fill silence with something other than the sound of trying to earn love from people who'd never been selling it. Therapy helped. Dr. Sarah Lindemann had an office in downtown Westfield, 2 miles from my parents' house, but a universe away from the woman who'd raised me to believe that love was something you earned through perfect behavior and selfless sacrifice. She taught me that grief doesn't vanish, it transforms, the way coal becomes diamond under pressure, the way broken bones heal stronger than they were before the break. "Tell me about Ethan," she'd say during our sessions, and I'd spend 50 minutes talking about soccer games and bedtime stories and the way he used to sneak into my bed during thunderstorms, his small body warm and solid and real against my back. Not my parents, not their betrayal, not the ways they'd failed both of us. Just him. Just the 7 years of pure joy they'd been too focused on Michael's achievements to fully appreciate. On a Saturday in November, I planted a Japanese maple in my backyard, its red leaves brilliant against the gray sky that promised snow before Christmas. The tree was small now, barely 4 feet tall, but the nursery owner had promised it would grow strong, its roots spreading wide and deep, creating stability that could weather any storm. "This one's for you, baby," I whispered, pressing soil around the base with hands that had learned to plant instead of beg, to build instead of apologize. "Your great-grandma would have loved this tree. She would have loved watching you climb it." The Memorial Scholarship Fund launched on what would have been Ethan's 8th birthday. $500,000, plus interest, designated for children whose families understood that showing up was the minimum requirement for claiming someone as your own. The first recipient was a 7-year-old girl whose grandmother had been saving nickels for her college fund, whose parents had driven 6 hours to attend her school science fair because they understood that love is measured in presents, not promises. My parents found out about the scholarship from the local newspaper, which ran a story about the Memorial Fund in their Sunday edition. The reporter had interviewed me in my backyard, the Japanese maple visible in the background, its roots already beginning to spread beneath soil that belonged to people who'd chosen each other instead of being assigned by genetics. The phone calls started again after the article ran. Voicemails filled with outrage that I'd stolen money that belonged to the family, demands that I reverse decisions they had no power to change, threats to contest the scholarship fund through lawyers they couldn't afford to hire. I listened to exactly one of them before deleting the rest without playing them. My father's voice, sharp with the kind of fury that comes when people who've never been told no finally encounter boundaries they can't bulldoze. "You're making a mistake, Savannah. Family is all you have. Blood is thicker than water, and you're going to regret burning bridges you can't rebuild." He was right about one thing. Blood is thicker than water. But love is thicker than blood, loyalty is thicker than genetics, and showing up when it matters is thicker than any family tree that's been pruned of everyone who actually deserves to be included. They may have skipped his funeral, but they would never own his legacy, or mine. Standing in my backyard as winter settled over New Jersey, watching snow collect on branches that would bloom again when spring returned, I finally understood what my grandmother had been trying to teach me all those Sundays when she'd brought butterscotch candies and stayed for dinner even when my parents made it clear her visit was an obligation they tolerated rather than a gift they treasured. Family isn't who shares your DNA. Family is who shows up when showing up is hard. Who celebrates your victories without keeping score. Who holds you while you're broken and helps you remember what it feels like to be whole. In grief, I'd found my backbone. In betrayal, I'd found my freedom. And in letting go of people who'd never held on to me, I'd finally learned to hold on to myself. At 38, I stood in the kitchen of the house I'd bought with my own money, surrounded by friends who'd chosen me rather than inherited me, and faced the verdict I'd been building towards since the day I'd buried my son alone. The walls were painted yellow, Ethan's favorite color, and covered with photos of him at every age, from the hospital bracelet he'd worn as a newborn to the soccer team picture, taken 2 weeks before the accident. This was a home where his memory lived in every corner, where his laughter still echoed in spaces my parents had never bothered to visit when he was alive to fill them with joy. Sarah, my therapist-turned-friend, was helping me prepare dinner for the scholarship recipients and their families, Our annual gathering to celebrate kids who'd received funding for college because their grandparents had shown up, because their families understood that love is measured in presence rather than promises. The kitchen smelled like garlic and possibility, filled with voices of people who'd become the family I'd chosen instead of the one I'd been assigned. "You know what strikes me most about this?" Sarah said, stirring pasta while I arranged photos of this year's scholarship winners on the dining room table. "It's not that your parents failed you. It's that you succeeded despite them." The observation landed differently than it would have 2 years ago, when everything still felt like loss instead of liberation. Now I could see the truth in her words. Not the bitter truth of abandonment, but the sweet truth of survival. I am not their afterthought. The realization had taken 38 years to crystallize, but it burned with the clarity of something that had always been waiting for me to discover it. I am not their bargaining chip, their disappointment, their burden to manage, or their asset to liquidate when Michael needed funding. I am a mother who loved completely, who lost devastatingly, and who rose again stronger than the people who'd tried to keep me small. The trust fund had become more than money. It had become proof that love transcends death, that generosity can outlive the generous, that a grandmother's sacrifice could continue blessing children decades after her arthritic hands had signed the papers that secured their futures. 23 kids had received scholarships so far. 23 families who understood that showing up was the minimum requirement for claiming someone as your own. My phone buzzed with a text message, and for one moment my chest tightened with the old anxiety that came whenever technology connected me to people who might demand things I wasn't willing to give. But it was Marcus, my neighbor's teenage son, sending a photo from his first day at Rutgers University, a scholarship kid whose grandmother had driven 4 hours to attend his high school graduation because she understood that presence was the greatest present she could offer. "Thank you for believing in me when my own parents didn't," his text read. "Ethan would be proud of what you built from missing him." The tears that came weren't the devastating sobs that had marked the first year after the accident. These were the tears that come when you realize that loss can become legacy, that the worst thing that ever happened to you can be transformed into the best thing you ever do for someone else. That evening, after our guests had gone home with full stomachs and fuller hearts, I walked out to my backyard where the Japanese maple had grown from a 4-foot sapling into a tree whose branches could shelter a 7-year-old boy if he'd been there to climb them. I sat beneath its canopy, holding the photo I kept in my wallet, Ethan at 6, gap-toothed and grass-stained, laughing at something I couldn't remember but would never forget. The anniversary of the accident was next week, and for the first time, I wasn't dreading it. I was planning to spend it here, in this space where his memory lived in soil that had never known disappointment, roots that grew stronger with each passing season. The wind moved through the leaves with a sound like whispered secrets, and I found myself smiling through tears that tasted like gratitude instead of grief. Somewhere in Westfield, my parents were probably discussing Michael's mortgage payments or Jessica's pregnancy or whatever crisis currently required their full attention. They'd moved on from demanding Ethan's trust fund, probably convinced themselves that I'd been unreasonable, that they'd done nothing wrong by skipping their grandson's funeral to plan their son's engagement party. But their opinion had stopped mattering somewhere between learning to exist without their approval and learning to thrive without their presence. They'd demanded his trust for a wedding they deemed more important than his funeral, but trust was not theirs to take. It was mine to carry, mine to transform, mine to share with families who understood that love shows up when showing up is hard. His legacy would never belong to them. It belonged to scholarship recipients who'd had grandparents willing to eat peanut butter sandwiches so their grandchildren could afford better meals. It belonged to families who drove hours to attend graduations, who answered phones when grief called in the middle of the night, who understood that being family meant more than sharing DNA. It belonged to love, and love alone. The Japanese maple rustled in the evening breeze, its leaves catching moonlight like scattered stars, its roots growing deeper and stronger with each season that passed. Just like me. Just like the mother I'd become not despite my parents' failure, but because of my choice to succeed where they had failed, to show up, to stay present, to transform loss into love that would outlive us all. My parents may have skipped his funeral, but I would never skip my own healing, my own growth, my own commitment to making sure that every child who received an Ethan Moore Memorial Scholarship knew they were valued, not for what they could provide, but for who they were brave enough to become. That was the verdict I'd been building toward, not their judgment of my worth, but my recognition of it. Not their definition of family, but mine. And mine was growing stronger every day. If Savannah's story broke your heart and rebuilt it stronger, if you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect, if you've ever discovered that the people who should protect you are the ones you need protection from, you understand why this story matters. This isn't just about skipped funerals or money. It's about learning that family isn't who shares your blood, it's who shows up when showing up is hard. It's about understanding that grief can become a gift when you transform your pain into someone else's possibility. Hit that like button if you've ever had to build your own definition of family. Subscribe and turn on notifications because next week, we're sharing another story about someone who turned their deepest wound into their greatest strength. Share this with someone who needs to remember that being abandoned by the wrong people just means you're free to find the right ones. Comment below and tell me about a time when betrayal became the beginning of your breakthrough, because those stories remind all of us that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we do. Remember, you don't need permission from people who hurt you to heal from what they did. You don't need approval from people who failed you to succeed despite them. And you definitely don't need love from people who proved they were incapable of giving it. Savannah's parents demanded her son's trust, but the only trust that mattered was the one she kept with herself, to never let their failure define her worth. What trust are you keeping with yourself today?